AITA for refusing to give my parents money after I found out they spent my savings on my brother's college tuition over the holidays. Growing up, my parents always told me, if you want something, you work for it. So, I did. I worked part-time jobs through high school, shoveled driveways in winter, mowed lawns in summer, you name it. Every birthday check, every tip, every dollar I earned went into a savings account my parents managed for me. They said it was a college fund, a safety net for my future. But life doesn't always stick to the plan. I didn't go to college right after high school. Instead, I leaned into freelance graphic design. It started with a few small gigs, designing logos for local businesses, making social media graphics for influencers, and eventually grew into a steady, full-time freelance career. It's not always predictable, but it pays the bills, and I like being my own boss. Still, I kept that savings account in the back of my mind, a just-in-case fund. Maybe I'd go to school later, start my own design agency, or use it for a down payment on a house. It was mine, and I knew I had worked hard for it. My younger brother, Ethan, was a different story. He was the golden child, charming, carefree, and perpetually coasting on second chances. He dropped out of his first college after one semester, saying it wasn't the right vibe. After that, he spent a year working part-time at a coffee shop and making terrible YouTube videos about conspiracy theories. But this Christmas, when I visited home, Ethan showed up wearing a hoodie from a very expensive state university. "Check it out," he said proudly, pulling at the logo. "Mom and Dad are helping me finish my degree." I froze. Ethan going back to school wasn't the shocking part, it was how he was paying for it. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I cornered my mom in the kitchen. "Where did the money come from?" I asked. She didn't even try to lie. "We used some of the money from your savings account. Just a little to help Ethan get back on track. He really needed it." My savings account. That money wasn't a gift from them. It wasn't even theirs. It was mine. Years of grinding, saving, and being responsible, all siphoned away behind my back. "Are you serious? You used my money to bail him out again?" Mom looked guilty, but defensive. "We were going to pay you back. Eventually. Ethan just needed this chance." A chance. The same chance he'd been handed over and over while I'd been told to earn everything. I barely slept that night. The next morning, while my parents sipped coffee and Ethan unwrapped gifts like nothing had happened, I packed my bag. On my way out, I left a note on the fridge. "Don't ask me for a single cent ever." I spent the 3-hour drive back to my apartment cycling through every emotion possible. Rage, hurt, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of why am I even surprised. Ethan had always been their priority, and I had always been the backup plan. When I got home, I threw my bag on the couch and opened my laptop. Work usually helped me reset, but every design project on my screen just looked pointless. I kept picturing Ethan in that stupid college hoodie, grinning like he'd earned it. 2 days later, my mom called. Her voice carried that familiar softness, the one she used when she knew she was in the wrong but refused to admit it outright. She said Ethan needed the money more, that I was already independent, that I was doing fine. She avoided words like stole or lied. Instead, she wrapped everything in excuses, like it was some noble sacrifice on my part, even though I'd never been asked to make one. When she said I'd understand one day, something in me snapped. I didn't bother explaining or arguing. I just hung up. The weight of what they'd done settled deeper into my chest after that call. They weren't sorry. They didn't even seem to realize they should be. A week passed in a haze of work and resentment. I buried myself in freelance projects, hoping to distract myself, but every invoice I sent and every deposit I received just reminded me of what I'd lost, what had been taken. Then Ethan texted me, "Hey, I heard you're upset. Didn't mean for things to get messy. Can we talk?" No apology. No acknowledgement of what he'd done. Just Ethan being Ethan. Casual, conflict avoidant, and utterly clueless about the weight of his actions. I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Did he really not understand? Or was this just his way of skimming the surface of accountability without actually diving in? Ethan had always been charming, the type of person who could talk his way out of anything. When we were kids and he broke one of Mom's vases, he'd flash a sheepish smile, say something about how it was an accident, and she'd let him off with a laugh. Meanwhile, if I so much as looked at something fragile, I'd get a lecture about responsibility. I thought about responding. I thought about explaining, step by step, how every hour I'd worked, Every birthday check I'd stashed away, every late-night freelance deadline I'd pushed through had been mine. How every choice I'd made was careful and deliberate because I knew I didn't have a safety net like he did. But what was the point? Ethan had never faced consequences because he'd never been forced to. Our parents had always stepped in, cleaned up his messes, and reassured him that it wasn't really his fault. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the couch. Later that night, I opened the message again. This time, I wrote back, "No, you didn't mean for me to find out, Ethan. That's all you're sorry about." I hit send and turned off my phone for the rest of the night. The next morning, there was no reply. I wasn't surprised. Ethan had never been good at dealing with discomfort, and guilt wasn't a familiar feeling for him. But that didn't change the fact that he'd taken something from me, something irreplaceable. And worse, he didn't even seem to understand why that mattered. News travels fast in families, especially when someone screws up. It started with a text from Aunt Linda. "Sweetheart, is it true your parents used your savings for Ethan's tuition? Please tell me they didn't do that without asking you first." I stared at the screen, bile rising in my throat. Ethan must have let something slip, or maybe my mom had vented to someone, spinning it into a noble sacrifice I was supposed to be proud of. I replied with a simple, "Yeah, it's true." Within days, more text rolled in. An uncle I hadn't spoken to in years, a couple of cousins, even my dad's brother, who usually avoided family drama like the plague. Everyone wanted to express their outrage in carefully worded condolences. "That wasn't fair to you. Your parents should have known better. I'm so sorry they put you in this position." But despite the chorus of sympathetic texts, not one of them called my parents out directly. Not one offered to confront them, to demand they make it right. Instead, they offered me the verbal equivalent of a pat on the back and then disappeared back into their quiet corners of the family tree. I could almost hear the dinner table whispers happening behind my back. "Well, Ethan needed the help. She's doing fine on her own. She'll be okay." The thing is, they were right about one thing. I was okay. Financially, at least. My freelance gigs were steady, my bills were paid, and my fridge was stocked. But that wasn't the point. The point was that the money had been mine. Years of grinding, sacrificing, and saving. All dismissed because my brother needed yet another lifeline. One of my cousins, Kelsey, who's only a year younger than me, called late one night. "They really did that to you," she said softly. "Yeah, they did." She didn't sugarcoat her feelings. "That's messed up." I appreciated her bluntness, but it didn't make me feel better. Because the truth was, nobody in our family was going to do anything about it. They'd all cluck their tongues, shake their heads, and then carry on pretending everything was fine at the next holiday gathering. I realized then that the only person who was going to set boundaries with my parents was me. And those boundaries were going to have to be firm, because if history had taught me anything, it was that they'd find a way to spin this into my fault if given half a chance. When I hung up with Kelsey, I stared at my phone, my inbox flooded with well-meaning pity. None of it mattered. None of it changed what had been done. If my parents were waiting for me to get over it, they were in for a long wait. Weeks passed, and I started to feel like I was shaking off a bad hangover. The text from family slowed down, work became a distraction again, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. Then my dad called. It was mid-afternoon on a Wednesday, and I was halfway through designing a marketing deck for a client. I let the phone ring twice, debating whether to answer. Against my better judgment, I picked up. He started with small talk, asked about work, whether I'd been eating well, the weather in my city. It felt forced, like he was working up to something. And then, he got to the point. They needed money. Apparently, Ethan's tuition costs had gotten a bit higher than expected. There were some surprise fees, textbooks, and housing costs that weren't fully covered. Dad said they were in a tight spot and hoped I could pitch in just a little to help the family out. For a moment, I couldn't speak. They had already taken my money without asking, and now they were asking for more? Like I was some kind of endless ATM they could tap whenever Ethan screwed up again. I asked him if they had any plans to repay me for what they'd already taken. Dad sighed. One of those long, heavy sighs designed to make me feel guilty. He said they'd get to it eventually, but that Ethan's future was more immediate, more pressing. That's when I realized something. They weren't sorry. They were never going to be sorry. In their minds, they'd made the right choice. Ethan's education, Ethan's success, those were the priorities. And I'd been expected to quietly accept my role as the fallback plan. I told him no. Firm, simple, and final. Dad sounded genuinely shocked, like he couldn't believe I'd said it out loud. He tried to backtrack, bringing up family loyalty, sacrifices, how Ethan was trying so hard to make something of himself. But I was done listening. I told him that I wasn't their safety net, I wasn't their backup plan, and I certainly wasn't their bank. If they were in a tight spot, they'd have to figure it out without me. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just tired. Tired of being the responsible one, the self-sufficient one, the one who could always be counted on to clean up the mess while Ethan coasted by. For the first time, I felt something close to relief. I had said no, and I meant it. After that call with my dad, there was silenced, no texts, no calls, not even the usual passive-aggressive forwarded emails from my mom. It was as if my refusal had reset something in them. Like they didn't know how to handle me when I wasn't bending to their will. At first, the quiet felt good, peaceful, even. I threw myself into my freelance projects, went to the gym more often, and caught up with friends I'd been neglecting during the whole mess. But silence has a way of creeping in, whispering doubts when you're alone at night. Was I too harsh? Should I have tried to compromise? What if Ethan really is trying this time? But then I'd remember the way my dad had sighed on the phone, how my mom had justified their betrayal with soft-spoken excuses, and how Ethan had shrugged the whole thing off like it was just another hiccup in his charmed little life. The doubts would fade, replaced by a dull ache, a mix of anger and disappointment I couldn't quite shake. One evening, while scrolling through Instagram, I stumbled upon a photo Ethan had posted. Him grinning ear to ear on campus, wearing that overpriced college hoodie. The caption read, "Big things coming this year. Thanks to everyone who believed in me." I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. Everyone who believed in me. I wanted to comment, to write something sharp and cutting. But instead, I closed the app and put my phone down. I realized then that Ethan would never get it. My parents would never get it. They had built their own narrative, one where Ethan was the comeback kid and I was the stable one who didn't need anything from them. And maybe that was the root of the problem. They had mistaken my independence for immunity, my self-reliance for an infinite well they could draw from without consequence. The silence stretched on for weeks. At family gatherings, my absence went unaddressed. Mutual relatives would reach out with carefully worded questions. "Are you coming home for Easter? Your mom would love to see you." But there was no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a subtle, collective expectation that I'd eventually get over it. But I wasn't going to let it go. They could sit in that silence as long as they wanted. Months passed, and the silence became something I learned to live with. It wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, like a thick fog hanging over me. But it was better than another round of circular conversations where I'd end up being painted as the unreasonable one. Then, out of nowhere, Mom emailed me. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close. It was a long-winded message about how Ethan was really thriving now and how proud they were of him. Buried in the middle was a single sentence that made my blood run cold. "We're hoping you'll reconsider helping out a little financially, just until Ethan graduates." That was it. Months of silence, and they still didn't understand. I didn't respond immediately. I sat with the email for a few days, rereading it in the cold light of morning and again in the dim haze of midnight. Each time, the anger bubbled up until I felt sick. They weren't reaching out to mend things. They weren't reaching out because they missed me. They were reaching out because they thought I might still caved. I wrote back a single line. No. I hit send and blocked their emails. For a while, I wondered if I'd regret it, if the finality of cutting them off would gnaw at me in weak moments. But as the weeks turned into months, something unexpected happened. I started to feel lighter. The bitterness began to fade. Not completely, but enough for me to breathe easier. My work felt fulfilling again. My apartment felt like home, and I started planning a trip I'd been putting off for years. Sometimes I'd wonder how things were going for Ethan. If he was still at school, if he'd finally started taking responsibility for his own life. But those thoughts didn't linger. I realized that I wasn't angry because they took the money. I was angry because they had shown me, without a shadow of a doubt, exactly where I stood in their priorities. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. This wasn't a fight I could win, and it wasn't one I wanted to keep having. My parents made their choice. Ethan made his, and now I was making mine. The finality didn't feel sad. It felt like closure.